Welcome to the Grand Museum. Today I invite you to step beyond the glass, beyond the labels, and beyond the ordinary way of looking at the past. We are entering the Maglemose Gallery. What you see before you is not a fantasy. It is a reconstruction. The living ink can bring landscapes, tools, animals, and human activity into view, but it cannot change the evidence. Where the evidence is strong, we can show more. Where the evidence is uncertain, we must be careful. Our journey begins approximately 9,000 years ago, in the early Mesolithic. This is the world of the Maglemose culture. Come, let us see the landscape first. After the retreat of the Scandinavian ice sheet, southern Scandinavia was transformed. The ice withdrew, forests expanded across the land, lakes and wetlands filled the low places, rivers connected the landscape, and coastlines continued to change as sea levels rose. This was not the landscape we know today. It was a young landscape, still changing. The Maglemose culture developed within this environment, with its main center in what is now Denmark and extending into surrounding parts of southern Scandinavia. The period is generally placed approximately between 9,700 and 6,400 BC. For the people who lived here, the landscape was not simply scenery, it was their source of food, materials, shelter, and movement. And now we can begin to see the people themselves. Maglemose communities were mobile hunter-gatherers. They lived in small groups and occupied camps in different places as circumstances required. They hunted, they fished, they gathered plants and other resources. They worked wood, stone, bone, and antler. And they returned to places where the resources and conditions were favorable. Their lives were closely connected to the land around them. Notice where the camps are situated, beside the water. That is no accident. For the Maglemose people, waterways were essential. Lakes, rivers, wetlands, and coastal waters provided food, transportation, and access to different parts of the landscape. A paddle is more than a piece of wood. It is evidence of movement. A fishing point is more than a sharpened bone. It is evidence of a person working to obtain food. And a dugout canoe tells us that people could travel across the waterways themselves. Water was not merely something they lived beside, it was one of the ways they connected their world. But the waterways were only part of that world. Beyond the shorelines were forests filled with animals. Hunting required knowledge. The hunters needed to understand the behavior of animals, the changing seasons, the terrain, and the places where animals were likely to travel. They hunted animals such as red deer, roe deer, elk, wild boar, beaver, hare, and waterfowl. Their weapons could combine several materials. Wood provided the shaft. Flint could provide the cutting or penetrating component. Other materials could bind those pieces together. This is what we mean when we speak of composite technology. Now let us look more closely. Flint was carefully worked into different forms. A core could be struck to produce flakes, longer pieces could become blades and bladelets. Some of the smallest pieces were microliths. These tiny pieces of stone could become components of larger tools and projectile weapons. A single microlith may look insignificant, but in the hands of a skilled craftsperson, a small stone component could become part of a highly useful tool. The important point is that Maglemose technology was not simply about stone, it was about combining materials, wood, flint, bone, antler, sinew, plant fibers, and natural adhesives. Each material had properties that could be put to practical use. And many of those materials were organic. That brings us to another remarkable part of the archaeological record. Bone, antler, and wood could be transformed into an extraordinary range of equipment. Wood could become shafts, paddles, bows, handles, and other implements. Antler could be worked into durable tools and points. Bone could become points, fishing equipment, needles, and other specialized implements. And sometimes the very environment preserves these objects for us. In waterlogged places, organic materials that would normally decay can survive for thousands of years. Without those unusual conditions, much of this technology would simply have disappeared. So the archaeological record does not show us everything. It shows us what has survived. And that distinction matters. The Maglemose people did not live according to our modern calendar, but their lives were shaped by the changing seasons. In spring and summer, lakes and rivers could provide abundant opportunities for fishing and gathering. Boats could move across open water, plants, berries, roots, and other resources could be collected. As autumn arrived, the landscape changed again. Hunting became increasingly important, and people could prepare food and materials for the colder months. Winter brought different challenges. Resources were less abundant, the weather was harsher, and equipment had to be repaired and maintained. Movement through the landscape was therefore not random. It was a response to opportunity. People moved with the resources available to them and adapted their activities to the seasons. But now look carefully. The living ink is beginning to fade, and this is where archaeology becomes especially important. We do not possess written chronicles describing Maglemose life. There are no surviving Maglemose books telling us what happened each year. There are no written histories describing their camps, their journeys, or their daily routines. Instead, archaeologists work with fragments, flint artifacts, bone and antler tools, wooden remains, fishing equipment, animal remains, plant remains, personal ornaments, traces of settlements, and the materials preserved in the soil and water. From these fragments, we build our understanding, but we must always remember the difference between evidence and interpretation. An artifact is evidence. A reconstruction is an interpretation of that evidence. The purpose of archaeology is not to invent the missing pieces, it is to understand them as honestly as possible, and so our journey comes to an end. The forests, waterways, camps, hunters, boats, and tools begin to disappear. The living ink returns to silence, but the evidence remains. The Maglemose culture was a human society that lived in a changing landscape more than 9,000 years ago. They hunted, they fished, they gathered, they traveled, they crafted, they adapted, and although they left us no written account of their lives, they did leave traces. Those traces are enough to bring their world into view. For a moment, the museum allowed us to walk through that world, but the reconstruction must eventually disappear. That is the nature of history. The past cannot be brought back. It can only be understood. And perhaps that is the most important lesson of all. The magic can preserve the image of the past, but understanding gives that image meaning. Thank you for joining me in the Maglemose Gallery. The past does not belong to us, we belong to the past.